Like Purdue, it's just an example. Purdue losing to Fresno State is okay. We still win the Big Ten West. But me,
Billy Napier gets fired. I'm just kidding.
hey, really the best time of the year. I will be seated watching the Red Zone for 7 hours on Sunday. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to an episode of Backyard Banter. Johnny, James, Tanner. First, if you guys are new here, please subscribe. We're about 4 or 5 away from 300, and we were so blessed to have a special guest, Rich Hollenberg, on the episode this week.
Yeah, he's an incredible guest of the week. Johnny was lucky enough to get on. He's doing exactly what we want to do, just at a much higher level. So shout out to him for joining us. Super excited for this episode.
Yeah, very exciting. If you've ever watched Big 12 basketball over the past couple of years, I'm sure you've heard his voice before. Really good at what he does. Always alongside Fran Fraschilla. So great. He's a part of a great college basketball crew, and he's a great guy. So,
Without further ado, our conversation with Rich Hollenberg. Like we said in the open, we were joined by Rich Hollenberg, ESPN play-by-play guy for college basketball, mostly for the Big 12, the pre- and post-game host for the Rays, and the creator of the Break-In Breakthrough cohort, which I'm a proud alumni of. Rich, how you doing?
I'm excellent. It's a big day in sports in general, and I'm thrilled to be with you guys. I've been a fan from afar from a long time.
Thank you, and we're very happy to have you on. We'll get into maybe some of those at the end, but first we want to talk about you a little bit, kind of talk about your path to where you got to with ESPN and with the Rays, and just the path to how you got there.
Yeah, it's a very long and sordid tale, Johnny. You know a little bit of it because we've known each other for a while. But like I always tell up and coming people in the business who ask me for advice and ask me about how I got to where I've gotten to, there's no one path to success in any business, but especially in sportscasting. So mine, I think, is a little more circuitous than others. It's got a few more twists and turns than maybe a traditional sportscaster does. It started out traditionally enough. I went to Syracuse and I majored in broadcast journalism, and the list is long and distinguished without me included in that list of people who graduated from there. But I went there because my people who I looked up to the most when I was a kid, people like Marv Albert and Bob Costas, and the list goes on, those were the people I looked up to and I wanted to be like, and they went to Syracuse. So hell yeah, I'm going to brave the snow and the wind and the cold, and I'm going up to Syracuse for college. So it started out traditionally enough in that sense, but then it got weird, like it does for a lot of people. Couldn't find a job in radio or TV out of college. So I moved back home. I was teaching tennis and found a job at a company called Sports Phone, which I don't expect you guys to know about because it hasn't existed for a long time. You could probably tell from the title what an arcane idea it was. Essentially, it was a glorified sports gambler's outlet. So if you were betting on sports and you were dying to find out what the updated scores were, you would call this number 976-1313, and you would get a sports reporter, me, and dozens of other guys who would record every 10 minutes the updated slate of scores from that game. So if it was baseball season, like right now, I'd be talking about 15 baseball games, 15 basketball games, 15 hockey games going on, anything that somebody could bet on. This was before the internet, before social media, you name it, before cell phones. So I was dialing up a number, recording that every 10 minutes, and then putting it out there for people to pay for. From that job, I was able to specialize and get a taste of life covering the NBA because I lived in New Jersey. So Sports Phone paid me to essentially be a stringer for the New Jersey Nets before they moved to Brooklyn. So it was kind of a home game for me. I only lived 30 minutes from where the Nets played in New Jersey at the time. And I was covering the team, but giving premium content to the people who would call Sports Phone if they wanted to know why a game was, the spread of a game was a certain amount. It might have been because one of the players got injured or one of the players was sitting out or someone got traded. I would provide that content. So that was a great learning experience for me, albeit not on TV, not on radio. Then I moved on to something that, again, had nothing to do with sports and nothing to do with TV or radio, but I wanted to move out of my parents' house. So I got a job at the Associated Press in New York City, lived in Manhattan for a year, and literally I was living the life of a news reporter in Manhattan, which was exciting, but not what I wanted to do. Um, because of networking, and Johnny knows how I feel about networking and how important it is. I was terrible at it when I first got out of college, but I quickly learned how important it was because my first two jobs in television ultimately came from the network that I had unwittingly built. And the first person in that network was a former college professor from Syracuse. So I kept in touch with him. I'm living in New York at the time, grinding away, living paycheck to paycheck. And he called me and he said, there's a job opening in Great Falls, Montana. And one of your fellow classmates is a news reporter out there and let me know that the sportscaster for that station is leaving. Are you interested? Something that I live by and I encourage everybody to live by in this industry is you just say yes to every opportunity. There are no bad opportunities out there. And so I didn't know anything about Great Falls. I didn't know anything about the TV station, but I said yes. And I interviewed over the phone. I got the job over the phone. And in a matter of weeks, I was packing my bags and moving out to Great Falls, Montana. Covered a rodeo in my very first sportscast. I mean, I'm a Jewish kid from New Jersey. I didn't know anything about this stuff, but I learned quickly. 6 months later, same exact thing happened, albeit on a little bit of a bigger note. That same professor who I kept in touch with told me that another Syracuse grad was leaving his job as sports director of a cable station in Tampa Bay. Are you interested? Of course, I said yes. It brought me back to the East Coast, brought me closer to home. I didn't know anything about Tampa Bay, but I knew there was spring training baseball there. I knew the Bucks. I knew the Lightning. That was good enough for me. So after 6 months in Great Falls, I got the job in Tampa Bay, and I've lived here now for the last 29 years, as bizarre as that is for me to say. I've lived in the same house now for 23 years, going on 24 years, which is longer than I've lived anywhere in my life. And then from work relationships and other, good breaks and just working really hard, I wound my way into the two jobs that I have now. I'm going on 11 years now covering the Tampa Bay Rays, and I'm just finishing up my 16th year calling college basketball for ESPN. And none of it would have happened without the network that I had built out of necessity, not a luxury. I had to do it. My dad didn't know people in the business that could get me a job. I certainly didn't know enough people myself, so I realized how important it was to introduce myself to people and get my name out there. I didn't have an agent at the time, so no one was looking out for me but me. And, necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. So I had to invent my career, and I've been very fortunate to look back and now say that long and winding road has led me to not just one, but a couple of jobs that I really, really love.
Yeah, I would say I've been to Tampa now a couple of times. I'd say you're in a pretty good spot down there compared to where we're at. We're very thankful it's 55 degrees today. But
Yeah, there was snow on the ground 2 days ago.
yeah, but kind of talk about obviously with the Rays, that's incredible. I remember when I went to my first Rays game with Johnny, he was pointing you out there in the outfield. He's like, "Oh, they're filming the pregame show." I'm like, "That's pretty cool, actually." So kind of talk to us how you kind of came to be the baseball guy and then the basketball. Are those your two favorite sports, or is that kind of just an opportunity that presented itself and you had to take it?
I would side with the latter on those two options. I love basketball. Basketball is my favorite sport. I played it growing up. I coached my son, all of that stuff. Uh, but I love tennis too. Those are the two sports I played the most growing up. I just didn't see a way when I decided as a 13-year-old that I'm going to be a sportscaster. I didn't love tennis so much that I was like, I'm going to be a tennis commentator or a tennis reporter. Tennis is a sport you could play the rest of your life, and I hope I do. But baseball was a sport I always played and watched growing up. I mean, I lived as the crow flies 15 miles from Yankee Stadium. My favorite walk up until the walk that I take from my set to the press box at Tropicana Field now, my favorite walk used to be walking in from the rotunda to seeing the field at Old Yankee Stadium. I mean, I get chills thinking about it. And I grew up, obviously, I'm a lot older than you guys. I grew up in the late 70s when Reggie Jackson and Willie Randolph and Ron Guidry and Thurman Munson were winning World Series for the Yankees. So it was a dream for me. Then you fast forward another 10 or so years, and the Knicks are relevant again. And in 1994, it all culminates in the year after I graduated and I was living at home. The Knicks were in the championship series against the Rockets in '94, and that same year, the New York Rangers won the Stanley Cup in 7 games, and I was at that game, Game 7, when they beat the Vancouver Canucks. Still to this day, the greatest sports moment that I've ever witnessed in person. So, long story short, to answer your question, baseball and basketball have always been a part of my life, but the wonderful thing about this business is you don't have to pigeonhole yourself. You don't have to just be a play-by-play guy. I had no designs on being a play-by-play announcer. I did it because the job in Tampa Bay required it. I didn't take that job because of it. I took it and I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to fake it till I make it. I've never called games before, but I guess I'm going to have to learn. And I was calling, this is, again, almost 30 years ago, calling single A baseball, spring training baseball for the Philadelphia Phillies, Arena League football, not to mention tons and tons of high school sports, which we did every Friday night. So reps are really important, and that's the greatest educator for anybody. The more I did it, the more I was able to flex those muscles, the better I got at it, which ultimately led to me not having to fake it for an ESPN audition, and I was able to get that job. But being a host, that was something I always felt like I wanted to do. When I was going into college, SportsCenter was just blowing up with Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann and Stuart Scott and Craig Kilborn and some of the older names. That was when it was a real kind of cultural event, much more than it is now. And I said, when I graduate, that's what I want to do. But I quickly learned, even before I graduated, like, wait a minute, if I'm going to be a SportsCenter anchor, I'm not going to be able to go to any of these games. And that's what I really love. I want to be at the games. So maybe I'll be a sideline reporter. And then I quickly looked around the landscape and I was like, I'm not a female. I'm not as good looking as the females doing it. And that's all the people they're hiring right now. There were very few men who were sideline reporters. You can count on one hand with a few digits how many men were sideline reporters. So I said, so what do I do? And I decided then I'll do anything and everything until I find out what I'm best at. So I used to be fearful of the whole jack of all trades, master of none being me. Like, people are going to look at me and say, oh, you're good at this and good at this, but you're not great at anything. I soon learned that you can be great at multiple things, and there is value in that versatility, and it's paid off for me.
Yeah, I think you might have just answered it a little bit ago in that question there, but what is the most enjoyable part of each of your jobs? So working for ESPN and then working for the Rays. What's the best part about both jobs?
Well, since this is your first question, Tanner, let me first pass along that I'm sorry about your Boilermakers. Great season. It was a great run. Paint is one of my favorite coaches. They'll be back even without Zach Edey. But I digress.
He needed that.
Needed that.
The great thing about what I do is I have favorite things about each of them that are totally different. With the Rays, now that I'm in baseball season, there's something fun and special and galvanizing about being part of a team. Even though you're not part of the team, you are part of a team. And I was just doing an interview the other day, and they were like, how do you prevent yourself from being a homer and from being too biased for the Rays? And the answer is pretty simple. A, you got to be a pro. But B, the one thing you need to avoid is saying we. You cannot say we. I am not part of the Tampa Bay Rays. I just cover the Rays. And yet, doing 81 home games inside the stadium and being on the field and getting to know these guys and the coaching staff and the front office, you can't help but feel like you have a vested interest in their success. Not to mention, it's more fun when the team is winning that you're covering. So that's what's great about the Rays, is that team camaraderie, that atmosphere. Uh, Covering basketball, nothing gets my juices flowing more than that. Having the best seat in the house for some of the biggest college basketball games all year. I'm blessed and humbled that I've gotten to cover what I think is the best conference in college basketball the last number of years. I'm close to a decade now where I've called Big 12 basketball, but I called the SEC before that. I've called the ACC. I worked my way up from smaller conferences, some of the mid majors, where I really cut my teeth. And the energy I get from that, it doesn't matter if it's a small conference and a non-consequential game in the big picture of things. Every time I sit down at that seat and put the headsets on, it feels like a big game to me, because everyone in that gym, it's a big game to them. And the players on the floor and the coaching staffs, it's a big game to them. And sometimes it's even more fun when you're covering a smaller conference and smaller schools, because it means more to them when ESPN shows up to televise one of their games. And I never took that for granted, and I still don't. It's a big deal to the schools. It's a big deal to the fan bases, and that's the biggest thing that I love and hope to continue doing for as long as they'll have me with college basketball, is that it's the best seat in the house, and that's what I always dreamed of when I said I want to be a sportscaster. If I closed my eyes and thought about it, it wasn't sitting in a studio, it was being at the game with a microphone to talk about it. And that's what I get to do during basketball season.
Yeah, everyone sees kind of like the glitz and glamour like that, being courtside of some of the biggest games, and seeing it's always a welcome sight. I watch almost every Rays game, and seeing you and Doug Wechter on the pregame for the Rays and the postgame. But everyone sees all the glamour of it. What would you say is the hardest and most difficult part of it all?
Uh, the hard part is dealing with the uncertainty in the business. Like, we're all insecure, no matter how confident and exuberant we come off as in person or on camera. Every one of us is insecure. I mean, we all got into this because you have to have some substance of an ego to say, I want to be on television, or I want to be on the radio, or I want to host a show called Backyard Banter. I want to have a podcast. You have to have an ego. You have to think that other people are going to be invested in what you have to say. So that ego is also counterbalanced with insecurity. What if no one likes me? What if I'm not popular? What if I can't get a job? So there's all of that, and that still exists. You can't control some of the decisions that are made. Like, would I love to call March Madness games? Yes. Is there a way for me to do that right now? No, because I'm under contract to ESPN. So I can't control that. I just have to accept things like that. Would I love a chance at calling baseball play-by-play for a major league team? I've done it. I filled in for Dwayne Stats, but Dwayne's not going anywhere right now, at least for the foreseeable future. So I can't control that. So with that, the answer, Johnny, is simply that there's a lot of unknown variables that are out of your control. And the business we work in, fortunately, but mostly unfortunately, is really subjective. And we could be the greatest broadcaster that we could be and still not get the reps or the jobs or the opportunities that we want or feel like we deserve because of how we look, how old we are, the color of our skin, our sexual orientation. Like, people have to check boxes. And we live in a world now in general, but specifically to our industry, where, diversity is magnified, inclusion is magnified, and rightly so. I celebrate that. But that means that I also have to understand when I don't get opportunities that I might want or feel like I deserve, there are factors out of my control that are determining that. So it's hard to accept that. And you get a lot of no's more than you get yeses, even at this stage in my career. But you learn to accept it and use it as fuel and move on.
Yeah, that's great. You kind of talked about it earlier about being at Game 7 of the Rangers there, being one of the best memories in sports. So kind of take us, if it's that, then great. But what is the best game that you've been at or a part of? And then if that's one of your calls, then even better. Like just kind of talk us through that moment where you were like, holy cow, like whether I made it or I was so happy to be here. What's your best game or call?
Yeah, the pinch me moments, right? That's what you're talking about, James. I there's a couple that I go to, and I always apologize because I get this question asked, and you would think with the number of times that it's been asked, I would have my answer like right away. Um, but I guess I'm fortunate. I feel like there's a few that I would go to. The first that comes to mind is, and this goes back to covering smaller conferences. This was 10 years ago. Actually, yeah, it was around 10 years ago, maybe a little more than 10 years ago. And I had gotten the call up from covering the Ohio Valley Conference and the SWAC and the MEAC. And I was just like in the mud, like really grinding my gears, calling those really small conferences. And I got a big call up to the Missouri Valley Conference. I didn't know a thing about the Valley, but I knew that they loved basketball. And at that time, the two big teams were Creighton and Wichita State. And just by luck, the year that I got called to do that league, and I ended up covering them for 4 years, that was when Doug McDermott was at Creighton, and that was when Greg Marshall had taken over at Wichita State and was turning them into not just a power in the Valley, but a national basketball power. So I got to call every significant game that those two teams were playing at the time that they came to prominence on a national scale. So two things come to mind with Wichita State. One, the season they went undefeated, and it was the first time since that Indiana team in 1976 completed a full season undefeated. UNLV had done it as well, but they ended up losing in the championship game. That year, I was on all of the important games, and I kept looking at the schedule and looking at the schedule. I'm like, ESPN's going to bump me. They're just going to bump me. It's going to get to the point where they're 17-0, and all eyes are going to be on Wichita, and it's going to be a game that they're going to want their best announcers calling. And I was just waiting for that phone call, and the phone call never came. And College Game Day showed up, and Bobby Knight, God rest his soul, showed up, and all eyes of the basketball world were on Wichita, Kansas for that Saturday afternoon. And I got to call the game when Wichita State finished their season undefeated. It was something I'll never forget, especially, again, because I had covered that team for 4 straight years. And that was a day and age still when everyone stayed for almost 4 years. So I knew the players, Fred Van Vliet, Ron Baker, guys who played in the NBA, Greg Marshall, who's a friend to this day still. So it meant something to us as the announce team, other than, wow, this is a big moment in college basketball. It was a big moment for that team and those people. And that was really, really fun to be a part of that. The other one is something that no one would remember unless you're a fan of Old Dominion and Trey Freeman, who most people wouldn't know about. But this was when I was still calling NIT games. And the biggest NIT game that I called, because I never got to Madison Square Garden for the semifinals and the finals, that was the big draw of the NIT. But it was the chance to go to New York City and play at MSG. That's what all these teams wanted to sign up in the NIT for. And Old Dominion was playing Murray State. And Murray State was a small college power. They had Cameron Payne, who's been in the NBA, and they were favored on the road against Old Dominion. And I was calling the game with one of my closest, dearest friends, LaFonso Ellis. And it got to the point where it was a 1-point game. Murray State had the lead, 3 seconds left, timeout on the floor. And Fonz and I were just in the moment. And I let him do his job, which is to forecast what he thinks is going to happen. And he said, Old Dominion's got to get the ball in the hands of Trey Freeman. He's their best player. And that's exactly what happened. And Trey Freeman hit a 35-footer to win the game and send ODU to Madison Square Garden. And my call was still to this day one of the favorite things I've ever said, because it was completely unscripted and unplanned. And to that point, I thought, like, if you're going to nail a buzzer beater, you had to have it written down. because how else were you going to pull it off? And he hit it from the wing, like from the logo area. And my call was Trey Freeman on a wing and a prayer. And then I just laid out and shut the hell up and let the pictures tell the story. And I remember Fonz and I just looking at each other like we wanted to hug each other. It was so much fun.
There it is. Here's Freeman. That's a travel. He's got a shot. Oh my God! Oh my God!
I still get goosebumps talking about it. Fonz is still one of my best friends to this day. I still think about that game as, maybe not the biggest stakes in the world, because we're not talking about a conference championship or even a tournament championship. But for those kids in that moment, that was the biggest game of their lives. And I was just proud to punctuate that for them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So I gave you 2.
No, that's great.
Better.
We'll take as many as you can give us.
So I just want your thoughts on the future of college sports with NIL and all the conferences realigning. How do you think the college landscape is going to look here in the next few years?
Tanner, I start to sound like the old man saying, get off my lawn when I start talking about this, because I'm a traditionalist. I wish every player had to stay at least 3 years. You couldn't go to the pros right after high school. Like, I'm really, really old school. I think players getting paid is fine. I think they deserve to get paid. But unfortunately now what used to be illegal is now being done legally. And even if you're following the letter of the law, it's probably not being done legally. NIL is not supposed to factor into recruitment, but we're all stupid idiots if we think that it's not being. I mean, why would you leave a school and go to a school that has less of a chance to win or anything other than a handful of reasons? And those reasons are not the greatest reasons. One is I'm not happy with my playing time, so I'm going to transfer somewhere where I think I'm going to get more playing time. So that's a me, not a we attitude. I'm not a fan of that. The other is the bag, right? They're offering me more money. Again, you're doing it for the wrong reasons then. You're not doing it for the collegiate experience that I feel, should at least factor in a little bit to it. So for those reasons, I feel like things are really murky right now for college. I think what people had predicted a few years ago is starting to come true. And one of the biggest dominoes to fall, and I don't know how much attention you guys gave it or how much it was talked about, but there is now going to be a tournament counter to the NIT where it's going to pay the team that wins $1 million in NIL money or something like that. And it's going to be held in Vegas. And you better believe that teams are going to say, I'll take that instead of I'll go to the NIT or something like that. And what that's going to do is that's going to open Pandora's box for teams to then say, you know what, maybe I'll opt out of the NCAA tournament. If they're offering my team $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, because somebody's going to step in with that kind of money and that kind of funding and say, hey, we could build something that will compete or take away from the NCAA tournament. And then the other thing that could kill the NCAA tournament are the teams themselves. If everybody ends up deciding we want 4 or maybe 5 super conferences, and there's going to be 24 teams in all of these conferences, then what happens to the mid-majors? What incentive do the big schools have to play the little schools anymore? Not just in tournaments, but even in the regular season. Like I said, I call the Big 12. Next year, there's going to be more teams in the Big 12 than ever before. They're going to have to go to a 20-game regular season schedule instead of 18. That might not sound like a big thing, but all it means is there's 2 fewer non-conference games that they're going to get to play. And would those be bye games? Well, you don't want to take that many bye games anymore because that might hurt your strength of schedule and seeding purposes when it comes to the NCAA tournament. So what do? There are what they call O&Os. ESPN owns a ton of tournaments, and they usually put together good fields. Are teams going to be less incentivized to go play those tournaments because they're like, we can't afford to play 6 games now like we used to in November. We have to save those games because we're playing 20 conference games. So there's going to be a lot of changes coming very soon. And I'm not so sure that all of them are great. I think it'll regulate itself somewhere down the line. NIL will, the league restructuring will. And that's for people a lot smarter and above my pay grade to make those decisions on.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's wild personally to me that you could be going to Arizona next year for a Big 12 game and calling an Arizona BYU conference game. I
Weird.
I don't, that kind of blows my mind. I don't know how good that is I know that's more of a college football problem with all the money in that, but yeah, but hopefully to something more positive here. As a Rays fan, I have to ask about the Rays. Obviously, they had just had a winning road trip. Seems like half their team's on the IL until the All-Star break. Give us kind of a little preview on the Rays, and should us as Rays fans expect yet another playoff berth? I think it would be the 7th straight year if they did.
They've been in 5, so this would be 6. I'm wearing this shirt in your honor, Johnny. I think that a winning road trip is a win no matter who you are and no matter what teams you play. There's something that I always allude to in basketball and in baseball, fellas, and it's called the psychology of the schedule. You look at a team's record and you have to look at who they're playing. So last year, the Rays played almost all last place teams en route to a history-making start. They were 13-0. They were 20-3. They were 27-6 at one point, and you knew that wasn't going to hold up. You just knew it because the first 13 games was against all last place teams: Oakland, Detroit, Washington Nationals, even the Red Sox. Those were all crappy teams. Nobody knew that to what extent at that point, but you play the teams that are on your schedule. And because of a balanced schedule now, and we're in the 2nd year of that in Major League Baseball, water always finds its level. That's what Joe Madden used to always say. So were the Rays a playoff team? Absolutely they were. Were they a 120-win team last year? There's no chance. But they ended up winning 99 games. So I think the way they started was more indicative of the kind of team they were than, well, they're not that good. I just think that the Texas Rangers got hot at the right time, and they went on an 11-game road winning streak in the playoffs. That's like mind-blowing to win the World Series. This year, the Rays start their season off playing 2 playoff teams, those Rangers and the Toronto Blue Jays, and they started 3-4. Was that ideal? No, but now they go 4-2 on a road trip against 2 teams they should be. So now they're above 500. It's weird to say after 2 weeks, this is only the 2nd day of the season that the Rays are over 500. But if they could just hold the water for another month, that's when hopefully we'll see people like Taj Bradley, people like Shane Baz start to emerge to help that starting rotation. Losing Brandon Lau just sucks, man. It sucks because this is like the 3rd year in a row I started the season going, Brandon Lau's the X factor. If he's healthy, this team could win 95 games again. And now he's hurt again. And usually an oblique is 4 to 6 weeks. So here's hoping that Brandon Lau gets back sooner than later. They do have help on the farm. Junior Caminero is deemed healthy, and he could certainly help. But Jose Caballero's off to a terrific start. That's a pleasant surprise. I still think their offense can be as good as it was last year. They're 7-6 right now, and Yandy Diaz and Randy Arozarena are, I think, hitting under the Mendoza line or somewhere near there.
Yep.
And those 2 guys had career years last year. They were all-stars. So again, even if water just finds its level and they don't hit 300 with 20-plus home runs, even if they approach that, I think this could be certainly a top 10 type offense. And then in Kyle, we trust.
Yep.
I think this pitching staff is going to figure out a way to right the ship. I think they'll cut down on the walks, which has been the biggest outlier at the start of the season. The pitching staff in general, starters and relievers, are walking too many guys, and that's led to an inflated ERA and other numbers that aren't Rays-like. But if you trust anybody to right the ship, it's Kevin Cash and it's Kyle Snyder. And those 2 guys are still the manager and the pitching coach last time I checked. So my faith and trust is in those guys. And yes, to answer your question, Johnny, I firmly believe at this point that they can win 90+ games and will make the postseason for the 6th straight year.
That's what I needed to hear. And people don't realize that Brandon Lau is one of the fastest second basemen ever to 100 home runs.
The fastest if you go by games played.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he's been in the league a long time, and it took him a long time to get to 100 games played. But he got 100 home runs faster than anybody in Major League history as a second baseman. If you go by games played, it's remarkable.
Yeah, and then you got guys even like Jonathan Aranda and Josh Lowe that are hopefully back in the next few weeks. Yeah, Josh Lowe threw James a ball at the game we went to. And even if you can get a Jeffrey Springs and a Drew Rasmussen back, maybe sometime in April, maybe late July. I'm not talking. Bring me another boat parade. I'm not gonna go too far, but
I just kind of want to ask you about like how much prep it takes. So maybe talk about like a day in the life if you're calling a Big 12 game. And then maybe talk about like tomorrow. The Rays have a game tomorrow evening against the Giants. So like what would that day look like tomorrow?
Well, let's see. I'll start with the Rays first since I have it right in front of me. And literally, I've already started prepping for it. So for me as a play-by-play guy, as a pre and post game guy, you know, a lot of what I do is somewhat formulated. The pregame show, we have a rundown of topics we're going to cover. The postgame show is all about reacting to what we just saw. So that's a lot more free-flowing, if you will. But I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to this. So I've had this last series off. So I actually got a head start on prepping for the Giants. What I do, and I could show you this right now, even though it's gobbledygook, this is essentially like the start of my prep. So everything that I want to remember to mention or work in, notes, stats, interesting nuggets, I write in the column of my pad. But as you can see, this is what it looks like when it's completely done. Like I script out everything in the first segment. And by script out, what I mean is it's not word for word. Everything is off the cuff and extemporaneous, except for the very beginning of the show. The very beginning of the show, I know I'm not on camera. I know we're welcoming people in, and that's a chance for me to kind of set the stage for what's at stake and why you want to tune in and things like that. So I script that a little more carefully, and I could read that off my pad. Everything else just goes from topic to topic. And then the other 3 segments of the pregame show are very similar. We'll have interviews, we'll have things like that. So Baseball Reference, I don't know if you guys have ever been on it, but it is a Bible of baseball information. That's my number one go-to. And literally, I'm a creature of habit. So, you know, it's still school days now. I have 2 kids still in high school. So we wake up around 6, help get them off to school by 7. I do a little reading to kind of get my mind straight. Then I'll come into the office and I'll hop onto Baseball Reference, MLB, ESPN, and any other sites that might have information for me. I'll also scroll through looking at the team we're playing, looking at their local newspaper reporters for kind of angles that the national might not get. And those are the things that I'll write in the side. You know, if I notice any trends myself, Baseball Reference is excellent about that because you can find splits and game logs and you name it. So I do most of my work first thing in the morning. Then I'll go to the gym, I'll work out, I'll come back, I'll eat something, and then I'll kind of settle in again and look at anything that needs to be updated or refreshed. Usually around lunchtime is when I'll get my rundown sent to me by my producer. And then I could really dive in and start prepping for the show. I go to the ballpark at around 3 o'clock. For now, the games are starting at 6:50 during the weekdays. So that actually almost doubles the length of our pregame show because we go from 6 o'clock right up until close to first pitch. So that's new this year. But essentially, once I get to the ballpark, it's go to the press box, grab all the notes that I can grab, go down to the field, listen to Kevin Cash's pregame scrum, as we call it, talking to all the reporters. And then I used to, before COVID, go into the clubhouse and talk to the players. I don't do that anymore. They still, believe it or not, most teams, it's kind of like the new normal. Unless you are an everyday reporter for the team, you stay out of the clubhouse. You give them their space. And anybody that I would want to talk to is going to be coming out to the field to take BP or throw soft toss or do whatever. And I could talk to them when they're out on the field then. So I do all that. That usually lasts until about an hour before game time for me, showtime. I'll walk back over to the set. I'll make sure I get my makeup on. A half hour before showtime, we get on our mics and put in our IFBs, and we go over the entire show with our producer. An IFB, in case you're not sure, is that little earpiece you put in your ear, and that's how your producer and director talk to you during the show, even though fans watching can't tell that you have something in your ear and you're listening to them. But good producers, and I have a really good one, is always reminding me what's next, what's next, what's next. So I'll tee up Doug Wechter, my co-host, with a topic. And while Doug's talking, my producer, Brad, will say something to me like, okay, Junior Caballero's next. So even if I didn't have any notes in front of me, which I do, I could just off the cuff be like, all right, switching gears, let's talk a little bit about Jose Caballero. He's off to a great start, hits in 9 out of his last 10 games. And we're off on that next topic. And he'll get specific with things. We have that graphic coming up next. He'll remind me of that as we go along. He'll count me down into breaks, count me in from the breaks into the next segment, things like that. And that's, in a nutshell, what my day is like on a Rays game day. For basketball, stay with me, because I save all of my game boards. This was the last game I called of the regular season. So fortunately enough, I got to call Houston a lot. They were a Final Four team if Jamal Shed didn't get hurt. But this formula is what every play-by-play man has in front of him for basketball, for football, for hockey, for soccer, you name it. It's just some type of game board, obviously customized for that sport. And I get these done for me. The names, the statistics are updated for me before every game. And as you can see, I do a lot of my own handwriting on them as well. I write above, I write inside each name, but you see, it's all done in numerical order, so it's easy for me to follow. And this is what I have in front of me for every college basketball game I call. I make a point, and every play-by-play announcer should. I know the names and the numbers. That's your job. You cannot not know names and numbers. So those are memorized for me. I don't have to look down to see that. But I do peek down at those when I want to expound on something, when I want to tell a story about one of those players, when there comes a moment in time in the game where instead of calling a basket, maybe there's a stoppage of play, or maybe there's a timeout on the floor, an injury where I could tell a story or ask my analyst a question, things like that. That's where all that handwriting and the stories come from. So it's equal parts human interest and equal parts analytics and statistics. And all of that stuff is stuff that I keep track of, in and out of a game. And that usually, I'm prepping for the game 3 days before the game. The day of the game, I'm going to shoot-arounds. I'm talking to coaches. I'm talking to players. And then, just like in the baseball world, I get the rundown of what the show open is going to look like. Who are we going to talk about? What are the big topics? What's at stake? And we go through all that, and I get that prepped in my hotel room. And then 2 hours before tip time, I go to the gym, and we have lots of promos and sales items that I have to read through and make sure I don't fumble over those. We go over graphics. We call it a graphics rehearsal because the people who put together those graphics are human. They might misspell a name or get a number wrong or do something incorrect. And we always say, if we catch something, we say that's why we rehearse, because it's better to catch that mistake before you go on the air than have something like that go on the air and have Twitter blow up and take you down for making a mistake. So that's usually about an hour before tip time. And then it's just kind of soaking in the environment, making sure that all the key things that I have on my boards are committed to memory, and I have a really good grasp of, why is this game important? Why do people want to watch this game? And some of it sometimes is a sell job, but for me, it's an easy sell job because I'm psyched to be wherever I am, whether it's Ames, Iowa, or Norman, Oklahoma, or Morgantown, West Virginia, or Lawrence, Kansas. I'm psyched to be there. And the fans are packed, and there's going to be a lot of eyeballs watching. So that in and of itself is all the adrenaline that I need. But the last half hour or so before we come on the air, I'm trying to kind of focus in on, okay, just do your job, and less is more, and you don't have to oversell it because the game will tell its story by itself without you. You just want to provide the lyrics to the song that everyone's listening to, essentially.
Yeah, that's
essentially what my days are like.
Yeah, the game board is something that is so cool to me. I see pictures of them, and I'll see pictures of guys that are calling games, and I see pictures of the game boards, and I'm like, that's awesome because you have all the information right in front of you. But we'll kind of continue all this with college basketball. Obviously, it's one of our favorite sports to talk about and watch. It just ended, like you said, unfortunately for Tanner. UConn goes back to back. So obviously, for me personally, I'm a big East fan. In terms of watching, I think it's one of my favorite conferences to watch. So kind of talk to us about UConn's historic back-to-back, and then also piggyback, who do you think is going to get the Kentucky job? So a little two-part question here, but kind of hard-hitting questions here about Kentucky too. So
yeah, listen, it's breaking news right now. I found out, like you guys did right before we came on here, that Scott Drew was staying at Baylor. I would love to tell you, I knew all along he was going to stay. I did say on Twitter yesterday, the pros of him going were a lot less than the cons of him going. Or should I say, the pros of staying are a lot greater than the pros of leaving for Scott Drew. And ultimately, I'm glad he felt that way. He's become a friend. He's one of the reasons I love this league. I think he stands for everything that is great about college basketball. Going back to UConn, I just think they were the best team at the start of the season and the best team through the season and the best team at the end of the season. I have never seen, and I lived through 06, 07 Florida. You guys are probably a little too young to really remember how great those teams were. But I remember when they won the first time and they all declared, we're coming back. It was like, oh my God, like nobody does this anymore. And that was, almost 20 years ago. But still, to get all those guys back was miraculous. UConn does not have that. No team has that. UConn lost 5 of their 8 best players from a national championship team that dominated. They kicked everybody's tail last year, and then they turned it around and did the same thing again this year, come tournament time. And I just go back to, I remember meeting Danny Hurley at the Peach Jam years ago. And it was when he was still the head coach at URI. And I'm sitting there watching some ball, and like the Mocan Elites are playing, and all the best AAU teams show up at Peach Jam every year. And I'm watching him watch these players, and I'm going, so what do you look for when you're here as the head coach of URI? And he goes, I just look for a guy that no one else sees. Because if I see him and they see him, I'm not getting him. Yeah. And now he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. As the head coach of UConn, he could get anybody he wants, but he wants his kind of guy. And I love the fact that 2 years ago, before last season, when they got dumped early on in the NCAA tournament, I still remember what he said. You better get us now. Get us now, because this isn't going to be us after this. He knew it then, and boy, did he back it up. I mean, no one kept receipts like Dan Hurley kept receipts, winning back-to-back. And now, again, it's an outlier. He doesn't take the money and run somewhere else. for something better. He values his family's input, just like Scott Drew has in turning down the Kentucky job. You know, when they asked him live on the air right afterwards from winning the national championship, he didn't say, I'll have to think about it. I want to celebrate this now, whatever. He goes, ask my wife if we're going to leave in UConn. That's important. That's a factor, and it should be. So good for him. I think he does it the right way. Like I said, I think he's got his guys, and I don't think there is any question that whatever list you make of quote unquote blue bloods, UConn is a blue blood.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. Right? I think they're the 6 in the last 25 years, 5 or 6 in 25 years.
It's incredible.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And I've never seen this level of dominance. I mean, so Tanner's a big Purdue guy. James is a big Illinois guy. So they both got they both got UConn's wrath.
Yeah. And James, I don't know if you heard about this, but you know, my sources are telling me Brad Underwood's going to be getting a phone call perhaps now that Scott Drew's turned down the job.
I saw that on Twitter this morning. I was the one thing I saw about the Illini this morning was possibly Boswell maybe coming back to Illinois, but I don't see it for Underwood, but I mean, who knows? It in the surface that we live in now with coaching and everything and opportunities and
Never know.
So do you have a coach in mind that you think that if you had to piggy point one coach that's like, yeah, I could see him going to Kentucky?
You know, you have to be built for that job. And quite honestly, and I'm not speaking out of class, I don't know if Scott Drew would be built for that Kentucky job. Like, you really have to have your factors about you. You have to have the thickest skin possible. And that's not a knock on Scott. I mean, he authored the biggest turnaround in college basketball history. When he took that Baylor job, guys, that was, and I'm not joking, the worst job in college basketball. I mean, they had problems that no team should ever have to suffer through. And he took that job and people thought he was crazy. He was 1 year at Valpo. Why not stay there and follow in your dad's footsteps? And he took that job, and God bless him what he's done with it.
Yeah.
It's going to be Kentucky will not settle for a hot mid-major guy. I think now that Scott turned him down, I think they're going to go full guns blazing for Billy Donovan, even though I don't know if Billy would take that job. He's got ties. You know, I know this is probably stuff you guys know, but Billy essentially started his coaching career at Kentucky with Rick Pitino. So there is that draw from Big Blue Nation, but also from Billy Donovan's side. I listened to his press conference the other day. It didn't sound like a guy who was interested in going back to the pros. If you remember a couple of years ago, there were rumors that Brad Stevens was going to go back to college basketball. And I'm like, the people who think that anybody is going to go from the NBA back to college, unless they're forced to, is crazy. And maybe that's me not looking, you know, at the bigger scope of things. But Billy Donovan's got one of the best jobs in all of basketball, not in college, not in NBA. He's got one of the best jobs in all of basketball, major market, you know, dynamic team, all of that stuff. And I just can't see him taking the Kentucky job, but he is one of the few dudes who I would say could handle that job. He would be accepted with open arms from Big Blue Nation. And he would win immediately. And that's what I think you need to find. The one thing I think would be short-sighted of Kentucky is not looking for someone with maybe a little bit less of a pedigree, because in this day and age, what John Calipari proved is you can't win with recruiting freshmen anymore. You just can't. There are no longer going to be those McDonald's All-American dream teams that Cal was putting together year after year. You will not win with those teams anymore. What you can win with is, ironically, what Scott Drew has been putting together at Baylor. You still get transfers. He's been doing that for years and doing it as well as anybody. You sprinkle in a couple of blue chips, which he's been doing for years at Baylor. And then you mold together that team and you have that combination of players. You need veterans more than ever, but you need talent as well. And I think, I mean, Kentucky could do that as well as anybody. They just need a coach who can embrace that. Cal didn't, and he didn't want to, and good for him. But the new coach is going to have to do that. And so whoever it is, I don't have any insight into that. I'm at a loss.
Yeah.
You know, it would have to be, you would think it would have to be someone with Kentucky ties. They're too proud to not take someone who's got a little bit of Lexington blue blood in him, but they might be forced to look outside of that circle because they've been turned down a few times already, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah. We've been talking about a lot of coaches. Obviously, you interact with coaches a bunch throughout the college basketball year. Who are some of your favorite coaches to just sit down and talk to? It doesn't even have to be about basketball strategy, just to, converse with.
Oh my God, Johnny, I have so many. It's funny, just recency bias, since I just talked about Billy Donovan. I used to say that when Billy was coaching at Florida and I was covering the SEC, he was one of my favorite guys to hang out and talk hoops with because he didn't take those conversations for granted. It wasn't a necessary evil for him. He was all in on sharing and giving us a peek behind the curtain. And he was the first guy that I can remember who I covered who opened my eyes to the analytics side of basketball and how that trend was not going anywhere and it was only getting bigger because he said something really simple to me. And I remember it to this day. And this goes back, 10 years or so. He said, if you look at the Final Four teams, and again, it might not be true anymore, but if you look at the teams that make the Final Four, traditionally, they rank in the top 5 in offensive and defensive efficiency. He was saying this before KenPom was even a thing. And now everybody looks at KenPom and looks at efficiency. The NBA relies on that too. PER, player efficiency ratings, are huge in the NBA. That was all, after it started with guys like Billy Donovan in college basketball. So he opened my eyes to that. I was like, oh, you can look at numbers as determining factors for why teams win and win big and win traditionally year after year after year. Things have changed so much, but that's another point. Like I said, love Scott Drew. He's like family, and he creates that family atmosphere, not only with his program, but with announcers who he is familiar with and comfortable with. So love him. I loved Mike Boynton, and unfortunately he got let go from Oklahoma State, just wasn't winning enough, but he was another guy that was fantastic. And then, I'm leaving too many out. So I'll stop with this one because I don't want to mention too many at the sake of insulting people who I feel very strongly about. But TJ Otzelberger is one of my favorite coaches in all of basketball for all time in the 16 years that I've covered hoops. He is as real as it gets. Nobody is more comfortable in his skin than TJ. He's at his dream job and he knows it. So good for him. It's just fun to see someone come from such humble beginnings and background to reach this point where now not only are they a Sweet 16 team this year, but the way too early season predictions for next year have Iowa State in the top 10 in a lot of rankings. Like, that is mind-blowing. And they've been a really good program for a really long time, but not to the extent where they're on the national scene all year long. Like, they would make runs and win the Big 12 tournament. They would win a couple of games and surprise people and be in the Sweet 16. But now TJ, in just 3 short years, has built them into a program that everyone has on their radar. And I could vouch for, as great a coach as he is that much better a person. We've really hit it off and connected, and he's on my short list of guys that I really enjoy spending time with.
Yeah, anyone that can do what he did in the Big 12 championship to Houston, and obviously Coach Sampson over there is one of the best as they come. They're one of the
He's
best.
He is a walking, talking basketball clinic.
Yeah.
In one season of working with Kelvin Sampson, I feel like I've learned more about basketball and life and basketball life than maybe anybody I've ever come in contact with.
That's awesome. Yeah, for the last question, I just want to get into the cohort a little bit. Obviously, it helped me immensely. Obviously, you in general, your whole family's helped me immensely. And now there's dozens of alumni. So obviously, we have the whole group on LinkedIn. How did you think to start it just to help the young broadcasters, and kind of where do you hope to have it end up in, what kind of goals do you have for it?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. Second of all, I love the fact that we got to know each other so much better in the cohort, as well as outside the cohort. It makes my heart smile. But the whole idea of starting this came, believe it or not, from COVID, when everything shut down and I was in my office not doing much of anything. My best friend from college, who is an entrepreneur, he and I were talking about it, and he's like, "So what are you doing? How are you keeping busy?" And I said, "Well, it's interesting. Like, a bunch of college students have kind of found their way to getting in touch with me and asking me if I'll look at their demo reels and look at their resumes and just, talk to them about the business and things like that." And the more I did it, the more I enjoyed it. And my friend was the one who said to me, like, "You should start a business." And I'm like, I was the poster boy for having imposter syndrome. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's basically you're doing something and you're doing really well, and you're waiting for someone to call you out on it. Like, bullshit, you're not good enough to be talking about this. And I was just waiting. And he's like, "Why?" He goes, "You've been in this business for almost 30 years. People want to hear what you have to say." So I embraced it. We came up with a program that addressed things that I didn't think were being addressed enough or a lot, from the education standpoint on down to college age students and young professionals trying to make it in the business. And that's why I decided to call it Break In and Breakthrough, because it's not just for college kids. It's for, we have half the amount of people, and now we're over 120 kids who have come through it. But half of them have already graduated and they're on their first job or their second job. They don't want to just get a start in the business. They want to learn how to make a career out of this business. And look, I'm a survivor. I'm not a superstar. I'm just a grinder. I'm someone who loves what he does and still works really hard at it and still knows that I could get better and improve, and I have a growth mindset. And so I take my mistakes and my learnings and my successes, and I pile it all into 8 weeks of conversations with people who I think are just as passionate about sportscasting as I am. Like I said, and Johnny, you know this, you can't think of it as a job or even as a career. It's a craft. Not a lot of people are lucky enough to do it, and even fewer are lucky enough to be good at doing it. So if I can help just a little bit, help you either break into the business or break through to something bigger, then that's paying it forward. And that's what I'm at this stage in my career. I'm very comfortable where I am. That's one thing that COVID taught me, is gratitude. I am grateful to not have one job, but I have 2 jobs that I absolutely love. And now I actually have 3 jobs that I love, even though I don't consider this cohort a job, but I love doing it just as much as I love broadcasting. So as long as you do that, you never work a day in your life. So I'm essentially unemployed.
That's awesome. That's the best unemployed I've ever heard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, right.
Obviously, the connective tissue of the cohort has helped us out. Obviously, we had Alex on a few weeks ago. Rowan always talks to us. Spencer always reaches out, telling us how good
That's great.
we're doing. So
That's fantastic.
we just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on. We had a blast with it. I'm sure we'll talk this summer, but we wish you nothing but the best. Can't wait to see you on the broadcast tomorrow, and just thank you so much.
You guys, I'm as much of a fan of yours as you might be of mine. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Thank
really
you so
appreciate
much.
it.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys watched all the way through, please leave a like, subscribe. Again, special shout out to Rich. Obviously, I've known the Hollenbergs for a little bit. His son Brian plays on my AAU team, worked with his son Jason. Just the whole Hollenberg family is just a great family. Rich is a great guy. Really appreciate him coming on.
Yeah, great episode. I mean, a dream for us to sit down with a guy like that. So make sure to like, comment, and hopefully we get some more guests moving forward.
Yeah, comment who you think's gonna get the Kentucky job. That's been a big topic amongst us, whether we're on or off camera recently. So let us know who's getting the Kentucky
maybe
job.
if you find out before us, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll see you guys on Tuesday.
See ya.
Peace.